So it is so I've prepared a text, and but halfway through I'll also be showing a number of images for some research projects that I've sort of been part of for the past 4 or 5 years, and you will just have to bear with me because I will show some maps which really needed to be seen on a much bigger screen, but we will do what we can. Writing is a remedy that aids memory. As a way of remembering, writing is thus a poison, as it will produce forgetfulness of the person writing who no longer needs to exercise their memory. The invention of writing is thus a pharmacon, a poison for memory. It produces the opposite effect, external to memory, external to thought. Derrida thus redeploys Plato's strange use of the term in one of his early books, Plato's Pharmacy. When Plato referred to writing as a pharmacon, it prevents forgetfulness, but at the same time weakens one's ability to remember. Nevertheless, as poison cure, arsenic in Ehrlich's magic bullet transformed cellular architecture through a stratagem of violence that gave us the pervasive term, side effects. Depending on the content of arsenic in salvarsan's chemical makeup and its administrative regime, its metabolic interaction with the body, the kill ratio of pathogen cells to benign cells will determine the amount of collateral damage on the immune system of the diseased body, that echoes the practice of contemporary humanitarian and environmental violence. To use Eric Allier's words, Platonism appears like the primitive scene of a modernity haunted. As we poison the earth poisons us, poisoning the poison, an infinite doubling. In my theory of poison, human and non-human, organic or non-organic, a world of things also has a materiality that extends to social and political life. Consider the properties of arsenic, which made it so potent as a lethal poison, tasteless, colorless, and odorless. It leaves no trace of itself, making it the perfect murder weapon. Its efficacy is further enhanced by its ready availability. In Victorian England, it was widely used as a preservative, as well as in a range of household objects. The task of forensic science was to make this invisible poison visible in order to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that it had been employed as a murder weapon. Yet due to its mass consumption, it formed part of the environment of Victorian social life, in a way which both metaphorically and literally anticipates its environmental impact in today's global society. While science succeeded in capturing the poison through the technical practice of toxicology, it was nevertheless often difficult to prove causality precisely because murders and assassinations with poison took place against the background of an environment saturated with toxicity. For example, the abundant and unchecked use of arsenic in the dyes used for wallpaper and interior architecture. In tracing my theory of violence on geography of invisible inequalities, the first large-scale groundwater arsenic poisoning I explored was the result of a botched UN development project. In 1972, a year after the independence of Bangladesh, inspired by the Green Revolution, UNICEF, the World Bank, and the government of Bangladesh undertook a major public health engineering project, drilling millions of hand pumps aimed at providing safe drinking water, and over subsequent years, sinking those private tube wells became a normative practice. Although considered a major humanitarian success, it exposed a significant part of the population to groundwater's aquifers rich in arsenic. The distribution of arsenic can be traced back to the stratigraphy of the Bengal Basin during the Holocene period through complex interplay of geography, geology, biochemistry, climate change, and hydrology. But in 1972, that deep time encountered a historical time. Several decades on, the slow environmental violence continues to unfold at a population level in both Bangladesh and West Bengal. The same state and humanitarian players implicated in its complex causality are now charged with the responsibility of dealing with its consequences. The crisis in Bangladesh is considered to be the largest mass chemical poisoning on the planet, worse than Chernobyl and Bhopal combined. Furthermore, it lacks the spectacular disaster narrative which such names evoke. This environmental poisoning had neither intent nor motive. Wells dug at a territorial scale exponentially increased the porosity of the delta and mineralized the body of a population with a deadly poison that took decades to be detected. Attritional and creeping, such violence is what Rob Nixon in his book has termed slow violence, characterized by two salient features. First, it is invisible. It takes place out of sight, hidden in plain sight in the air or water from the point of view of media, but experienced with a delayed effect by its sufferers, mainly the planet's poor. What Juan Mari Martinez is called environmentalism of the poor. In the introduction of his own book, Nixon compares two seminal texts to show the contemporaneity and urgency of environmental writing intersecting with the post-colonial project. The first is Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring from 1962, and Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Nixon reminds us, and here I will sort of read a longer quote that's worth mentioning in the context of my contribution to the ensemble, and what I hope to propose to the group for what I hope will be a longer conversation. So I read a longer quote from his book because it was really Rob Nixon that very much articulated many of the ideas that many of us have been working on and research and so on, but he was really able to sort of bring it together in this one poignant book that sort of captures this particular sort of interaction between a kind of political ecology and the post-colonial project and so forth. Quote, in 1962, Silent Spring jolted a broad international public into an awareness of the protracted, cryptic, and indiscriminate causalities inflicted by DDT. Yet, just 1 year earlier, Fanon, in the opening pages of Wretched of the Earth, could comfortably invoke DDT as an affirmative metaphor for focused anti-colonial violence. He called for a DDT-filled spray gun to be wielded as a weapon against parasites spread by the colonialist Christian church. Yet his vision of temporal violence and of what Aimé Césaire called the rendezvous of victory was uncomplicated by the concerns that an as-yet inshot environmental justice movement, catalyzed in part by Silent Spring, would raise about lopsided risks that permeate the land long-term, blurring the clean lines between defeat and victory, between colonial dispossession and official national self-determination. We can certainly read Fanon in his concern with land as property and as fount of native indignity, retrospectively with an environmental eye. But our theories of violence today must be informed by science unavailable to Fanon, a science that addresses environmentally embedded violence that is often difficult to source, to oppose, and once set in motion, to reverse. End quote. Slow violence is durational, occurring slowly in such a way that it may not appear as violent at all. Slow violence is the opposite of the kind of violence that is explosive and spectacular and eruptive into instant sensational visibility. Because of their aesthetic, invisible indeterminacy, they therefore propose challenges as regards to their representation, being neither easy to capture or communicate. Importantly, Nixon warns us, quote, how do we both make slow violence visible, yet also challenge the privilege of the visible? That following Marie-Louise Prat had been a case of a planetary consciousness, when from the mid-18th century, science as a form of bourgeois knowledge allowed the European to develop a hegemonic view during the turn to the internal scientific land explorations and natural history as a field of study, beginning with Linnaeus' system of nature. Writing might be such a strategy of representation against a Eurocentric perspective of nature. Narrative imaginings of writer-activists can offer us a different kind of witnessing, of sight unseen, at once poetic and pragmatic, evocative and scientific, from Ken Saro-Wiwa and Inder Singha to P. Sainath, Chico Mendes, and many others. In my understanding of slow violence, I've expanded the notion to not only give shape and evocative plot to produce narratives of an oblique, amorphous violence, but attempt to evidence such violence and their diffused, non-linear causalities. To the question of witnessing, I might add, in the context of my research, also a kind of material witness. That is the matter itself that becomes part of this triangulation. To look closer at the limits of the legal forum, my research looked at the only legal case that has tried to hold international actors liable for the slow environmental disaster unfolding in Bangladesh. The case is a little-known toxic tort brought by NGOs on behalf of Binod Sutradhar, a Bangladeshi villager from the Brahmanbaria district in 2002, against neither the UN nor the Bangladeshi state, but scientists. In particular, British geologists from the National Environmental Research Council, who, in undertaking a survey to test the safety of groundwater to be used as a source for drinking water in Sutradhar's well in Brahmanbaria, had failed to test for arsenic in 1995. A report the government then used to draw up a national water policy. The case went to the High Court but was dismissed because the British judges decided that the scientists had no duty of care to the villagers, and the rural poor in the region still drink water polluted with arsenic. Actions and citizens that demands a new politics of the environment, science, and risk. I show that the law came up short in addressing the largest mass chemical poisoning on the planet, as a slow-moving disaster remains outside global public knowledge. In forensic aesthetics, presentation of evidence is a matter of persuasion towards a judgment, inconclusive as it may be. Arsenic poisoning, given its characteristic of invisibility, obfuscated the evidencing process. In the 19th century, toxicologists had to invent chemical apparatus capable of visualizing and arguing for the poison's presence in the body of the victim. But this was probabilistic at best at the intersection of the laboratory and the courtroom. For toxicology, aesthetics as judgment operated at the threshold of the visible, just as no effect is observed when the poison's administration at a low dose below the threshold of a dose-response curve, while the body itself metabolizes the poison. The maneuvers of toxicology to bring arsenic from not visible to visible allowed the law to judge, with enough circumstantial evidence at hand, a person is guilty or not guilty. Aesthetics was translated into and transferred over to the conditions for a judgment to emerge. We'll show you two parts of a sort of a visual presentation of this research that was recently presented at the Forensis exhibition at the Akademie Berlin. This installation is a sort of negative evidence of this case, where we might make a crucial sort of contradistinction to the history of toxicology, is that it was precisely the absence of testing for arsenic by scientists in Bangladesh that was the point of dispute, and not sort of the toxicologist's role of actually locating the poison. So it consisted of water samples taken from Sutradhar and his neighbor's well. Sutradhar, though I found out, had died, and I met his wife Achulata, who suffers from arsenic poisoning. And in a way, in the logic of the research, it connects back to the image of Cézanne's wife earlier that we saw. And his neighbor's wells in Brahmanbaria, where the legal case against the National Environmental Research Council was launched. The amount of arsenic in each water sample is graphically represented in circles of corresponding circumferences to the WHO double standards of permissible levels of arsenic in drinking water in the global south and the global north, a difference of 40 micrograms. The installation also featured interviews I carried out with the local NGOs, the UK law firm, and the geologists that were involved in the case. The third part of this, or another part of this work was an animation that abstracted the territory of Bangladesh as a laboratory for the measurement of arsenic. Imagine the water samples from the second work as mere points in a cartographic imagination. Interested in territorial contaminations and how they shift from the body to the territory and problematizes the status of sovereignty and self-determination, I'm engaged also in a long-term research project in West Papua, to which I was led to while researching the murder of the Indonesian human rights activist Munir Said Talib, poisoned by the Indonesian Secret Service with arsenic on a Garuda flight in 2005. The ongoing geopolitical investigation is on ecocide and environmental self-determination in West Papua, part of the third largest tropical forest system after the Amazon and the Congo, a militarized territory on the northeastern edge of the Ring of Fire, slicing the earth with immense seismic activity, volcanoes, and forming a mineral frontier along the edges and under the Pacific Ocean. That is a diagram to the research, no longer only a geopolitics of the surface, but transversal, eco-political, rhythmic, and militant. At this conflict shoreline, the research describes how the Indonesian state used the process of decolonization, mainly the Bandung Conference of 1955, to annex Papuan indigenous land that had contributed to the making of a de facto non-self-governing territory, a status contested by Papuan activists under the long rule of military occupation by the Indonesian state. This image, for example, shows the last communique of the Bandung Conference, which is a conference that brought together towards the non-alignment movement hosted by the Indonesian state, also known as the Asia-Africa Conference, towards a kind of third way between the Soviet and at the time of the Cold War. In this final communique of the conference, right under where they say that they are showing solidarity to the Palestinian people, it is an open war declaration against the indigenous Papuans, as the leaders of the Asia-Africa Conference unanimously supported the Indonesians' claim of sovereignty over West Papua with the Dutch. Tracing crucial historical moments, difficult definitions, and competing accounts of the prolonged conflict offers me a critical view of the decolonization process. Given that Papuans have had little control of their political future and natural resources, the research addresses the challenges of evidencing and articulating contemporary environmental self-determination from multiple perspectives. This image, I think, is very makes sense to show in Dhaka, because during the process of decolonization, when West Papua, when the Dutch were fighting the Indonesian state, the UN sent peacekeeping forces in the late 60s to this remote province of what would be Indonesia, and these peacekeeping forces were the West Pakistani troops. 3 years later, they would be committing genocide in Bangladesh. But at the same time, the research unfolds a kind of an archive that sort of brings together. I will get to this very much a cartographic project in just a bit, but the project sort of brings together sort of an archive of militant images that were sort of smuggled out of by the Papuan resistance to TAPOL, a human rights NGO that I work with on this case. And it's interesting to sort of see that during this time of the late into the early 70s, that you could sort of see this image making or a kind of performance of the guerrilla movement resonating with various sort of similar projects across the world. But the grievance of the Papuan people mainly rested on sort of two positions, and following the work of Pierre Klast, we can sort of claim that it's sort of, the shift was between an ethnocidal and a genocidal sort of project, right? Here in this image, Ibu Tien, the wife of President Suharto, went to the highlands of Wamena in the Central Highlands, near where this case very much focuses, to try to get the people of Wamena to wear Western clothes as a kind of ethnocidal project. And this image is quite interesting because I'm very much interested in the person taking photo, sort of making a video of Ibu Tien sort of ceremony, right? In a sense of documenting this ethnocidal process. But at the same time, the research, and this is sort of going towards this long-term cartographic project that I'm working on at the moment. Also, is interested in geographically locating some of the violence that has sort of historically taken place in Papua. In this case, locating the 1977 to 78 mass killings in the highlands, in the very place where Ibu Tien went to redistribute Western clothes, against a counterinsurgency launched in Dani territory. So spatializing this data from a recent Asian Human Rights Commission report called Silent Genocide. While this report is very an important document, it didn't show a map of where any of these events, sort of these killings took place, and this project is sort of interested in sort of working on spatializing some of this information. But of course here, another question must be revisited. The question, how do we both make slow violence visible, yet also challenge the privilege of the visible, is also pertinent to cartography. So this cartographic project is conceived mainly with Octavio Nusmot, who's one of the leaders of the United Liberation Movement for West Papua. The struggle is a politics of statelessness, to not only locate but bring disparate data sets to interact and to produce a spatial narrative of the conflict in the interaction of the built and natural environment, to use as an advocacy tool and in diplomatic forums. And for this, I've sort of set up a group called Earth Sensing Association, and we're working with architects and remote sensing experts, mainly over a series of workshops to produce a set of maps. And I'll very quickly show you some of these maps that we're working on. This one is looking at this idea that the West Papua is actually, after the Amazon and the Congo, the third biggest rainforest system, and biodiversity is a kind of multi-nature. It's constantly sort of present. But while there has been very much a scientific project to sort of produce this rainforest, it must be the politics, an eco-politics that I'm sort of working on is very much interested in sort of bringing the ethnic, or the fact that where there's biodiversity, there's also culture, there's also kind of ethnic diversity, and towards sort of this idea that the jungle is not a desert, that the desert is not a plain, empty space, that there is no terra nullius. In this one, this map tries to sort of show the interaction between the civilian and the military occupation in the West Papuan territory. This one, it would be great to again see these in a much bigger screen, so I apologize. This one is sort of looking at territorial resource, location of multinational companies that are actually located along the section of the Ring of Fire that cuts through the New Guinea. And this one is particularly looking at what is another scale of the research, which is to locate environmental contamination coming out of the Grasberg mine, which combined has the world's largest deposit of gold and copper, and has been at the heart of the dispute from the very beginning as a manifestation of state and corporate violence between the Indonesian state and Freeport, the company that operates the mine. This map shows the concessionary of the mine, but also indigenous, beginning to trace indigenous villages in this territory. Particularly in relation to the scale of the mine, I'm working on a collaborative research with geographers at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center that takes an ecological perspective towards developing novel techniques for detecting heavy metal contamination in aggregated forest, riparian and coastal areas using remote sensing for dense cloud-covered tropical regions in the southern hemisphere. Not sure. Okay, so this is a video again that is not playing. So we move on. For example, we developed an algorithm to see through clouds because these are heavily clouded sort of areas of the planet, sort of in these tropical zones, and it's very, very interesting to go back to the kind of Victorian narrative that I started out with, to think that while Victorian criminals could hide under the gaslight and fog of London, multinational companies can hide under the cloud cover of tropical forests. So it's a different kind of scale altogether of a kind of architecture of violence. I can talk about the urbanization of the forest and so on, but I'm about to finish, so I will just quickly end with my concluding remarks until we move to the next speech. And this is in reference to the work of Félix Guattari. In his book, The Three Ecologies, Félix Guattari has argued for a generalized ecology. Ecology implies the political at interconnected scales of mind, society, and environment, the aim of which will be to radically, quote, decenter social struggles and ways of coming into one's own psyche. Ecology must stop being associated with the image of a small nature-loving minority. Ecology, in my sense, questions the whole of subjectivity and capitalist power formations. Sweeping progress cannot be guaranteed to continue as it has for the past decade. Guattari's political ecology is global in scale in as far as he believed that we share both the planet as a commons and its multivalent crises. With his call to resist integrated world capitalism, or Jason Moore's conception of capitalism as a world ecology, that was prefigured by the European colonial project, does not seek to universalize ecology as only to do with the environment. Rather, Guattari dares us to think transversally through storytelling, as I try to do, across the three ecologies of psyche, socius, and the environment, and against discretization of thought. That has also been the lifelong project of Michel Serres. It is this democratization of thought that can open up new forms of commitment and towards the production of subjectivity, we might add literature. Crucially, Guattari tells us that the nature cannot be separated from culture in such transversal thinking. While there are methodological differences, it is here that there is a point of convergence, perhaps a tense one, in nature-society relations between eco-Marxist political ecology and the radical ecology of Guattari, and then beyond to more than humanist approaches, from Bruno Latour to Donna Haraway and Vivek to Castro, that includes non-humans and their rights as being constitutive in a planetary commons. The idea is, of course, totally contested by territorial conflicts and geopolitical endgames. How to think these all lines with new agency? How to think of the commons as a political project through a new kind of geopolitics, a politics with the earth, no longer a unified whole. Not only a threshold concept, but one of horizon. This, to me, is the ongoing work of both environmental writing as militant research, to suppress the toxic side of the pharmacon.